Our next guest, at a very young age, decided he would tackle an issue that no one seemed to have a handle on. He wanted to provide aid to orphaned and vulnerable children in the Port Elizabeth township of South Africa. Jacob Lief was also going to try something new. His plan was to provide essential services from cradle to career. The results are astonishing. His organization integrates health, education, and social services to build a sustainable community in Port Elizabeth. It provides children with everything they need, and Jacob Lief would argue everything they deserve. Since its inception in 1999, Ubuntu has grown to 70 employees and supports more than 2,000 children across 3 continents. Jacob has been named one of the world's 101 most innovative visionaries. In 2010, he was recognized by the World Economic Forum as a young global leader. He's a member of the advisory committee for the Clinton Global Initiative, and he's been doing that since 2012. You can read about his remarkable journey in his book, I Am Because You Are. He's here to share more about Ubuntu and his vision for the future of Africa. Jacob, a delight to have you here.
Thank you.
Okay, so you start this as a wide-eyed young kid, 2021. Now you're 37. If the 37-year-old could put his arm around the 20-year-old, what kind of advice would he give to the young guy just starting out?
When we started out, we wanted to take the bottom of the bottom, the kids who've been raped, the kids who lost their parents. We weren't looking for just the high-performing academic kids, but we started with grade 7. And what I realized 16 years later is it's too late in the game. Today we start with pregnant mothers. If you don't start early, in most of the world, parenting begins when a child's born. In New York City, we know those first 9 months in a mother's womb is essential, getting the nutrition right, making sure they're not drinking and smoking, making sure the mother's not being abused, ensuring a healthy birth. That's where you start. And I think the other thing is a motivated client, meaning we can't change someone's life if they don't want to change their life.
You know, what's interesting, though, I've met a lot of people who get into this field at your age, very young, earnest, who sit around and talk to other young, earnest people about this and kind of have earnest discussions. But there's a difference in what you did, which is you end up in this bar with this man by the name of Banks, and you have a few drinks, and then he says, come work at my school, and you end up living with him. And there's a difference in looking at something in an abstract, and then another issue of you actually living there in the environment and seeing it firsthand, isn't it? I mean, it's hugely different, isn't it?
So I stumbled upon this bar. I was down there for 6 months. The job I went for down to South Africa didn't exist. And I meet this guy Banks, and he says, come work in my school. I wasn't a teacher. I wasn't involved in education. I said, okay. And I don't know if I had much impact as a teacher, but what I saw over the 6 months was all this aid money, all this philanthropic money pouring into post-apartheid South Africa. And every organization defining success by how many cups of soup you hand out or how many computers you give to schools. And I would see these kids who've been raped, who are living in shacks, and I'm thinking, this isn't fair. A cup of soup, a wind-up computer, that's not how I got to university. It takes so much more. And that's really what struck me most about those 6 months living there, was just how, these lies we're feeding the kids. We were saying apartheid's over, you can go to university, and look at all this aid money and these great organizations from overseas. But they weren't really, these one-off interventions weren't doing anything.
But even when you got there and started, you got caught up in the numbers game until you realized that really wasn't the answer, right? I mean,
it's exciting. I'm not going to lie. It's how you get on the main stages of Davos or Clinton Initiative. It's to boast that you work with 1 million kids. And so we started designing programs to reach bigger numbers. And the point, which I talk about in the book, that really changed my life was this poetry club that I went and visited at school. And I started going day after day to this poetry club, and it started just observing. These kids were amazing. There were 8 of them in the club. And then one day, it was a huge rainstorm, and I drove one of the kids home. And I walked him into his house, and it was a shack, and water was pouring through the roof. And I'm thinking, what are we doing here? This kid needs so much more than a poetry club, so much more than a one-off workshop. And that's really how the Ubuntu model came about, this idea that we're going to invest in a child every day of their lives, give them what we believe children all around the world deserve, and that's everything. 100% wraparound services. We don't say to our child, oh, you can't see the blackboard, you need a pair of glasses. Well, we're not a vision organization. No, we buy them glasses. And that's real sustainability. Everyone always says, what's your exit plan with these kids? We can't raise a child in a 12-month grant cycle. We stick with these kids their entire lives until we get them into employment.
And one of the things you bring up in the book, which I loved, was this whole issue of scale. How do we scale this? That seems to be like the in word when it comes to providing aid. And you tell this story about this girl who's reached this milestone. She's going to graduate. You tell it much better than I do. Tell our viewers what happened and how you all wrestled with this, but you made the right choice.
Sure. This young woman who, not just the first in her family, she'd been with us 11, 12 years. She had lost both her parents to HIV at a very young age and raised her younger siblings. And she was about to graduate university. Truly remarkable achievement, the first in her community. And I hear all this commotion in our office, and I sort of step out, and her counselor said to me, oh, she wants this pink dress so she could, for her graduation day. And I sort of rolled my eyes and said, what are you talking about? We've given her everything, and we've gotten her to this point. And the counselor said to me, come on, Jake, this is what you say, treat these children like our own. And we bought her this pink dress. And to this day, she talks about the pride of walking across that stage, just like every other child at that university, in her pink dress, and how much that meant to her. And that pink dress, I think, really embodies the whole Ubuntu philosophy, this idea that we give these kids everything, we treat them like our own. You know, there's not a great innovation here. Everyone always wants me to come and speak at their conference on what's Ubuntu's innovation. It's an old recipe. It's how do you raise children? You know, you try to give them the best doctors, the best support network you can. If they're hungry, you feed them. If they're failing math, you get them a math tutor. And you stick with them. And the truth is, it doesn't always work. And that's the thing we don't talk enough about in our sector, how hard this is. The environment we work in, the legacy of apartheid, the generational poverty, the abuse, so much of it we can't control. So what can we do? We build a structure around these kids and try to keep them on track.
There's this concept of the white savior syndrome, as you know. Did you feel any pressure in that regard? And what are your thoughts on that?
Listen, I can't deny that I'm white. I'm male. I grew up in a family with 2 university-educated parents and had a lot of privilege. That being said, I've dedicated my life to this community. I lived in this community. So I think in the early years, I definitely overly romanticized the poverty. There's no doubt about it, because in the back of my mind, I knew I could always get out. I've struggled with it. I mean, race is at the forefront of everything we do in South Africa, right? The feelings of both inferiority and superiority exist. They're real. I've heard, you know, culture, which is really the word I like to fall on, is one of the most, I think, dangerous words in the English language. Culture has been used to defend the most horrible things, right? It was culturally appropriate to have slaves in this country, right? It doesn't mean it was the right thing to do. And people saying to me, well, you don't understand, Jake, it's not your culture. And that's why our model focuses on hiring people from our communities, from South Africa, who can say, no, hold on, it's not, don't use the culture game with me. It's not appropriate to have sex with your girlfriend if she doesn't want to. You know, I grew up in your neighborhood. I know that's not culturally appropriate. And the bottom line is that basic human rights and child's rights must always trump culture.
You, in your book, you talk about this, I think it was a boy who was injured and bleeding, and you helped him, and you're just soaked in blood. And then the realization that HIV is so prevalent. It really didn't dawn on you when you were coming to his aid, but HIV is a big piece of all of this that everybody talks about. What are some of the misconceptions about it? And you do talk a considerable amount about it in the book. These, as you mentioned, some of these kids, they grow up as orphans as a result of it. What are some things you'd like our viewers to know about it?
Well, I think it's children in the United States and England and the UK, we don't have children born with HIV positive anymore. The drugs work. And that's really extraordinary. So do we have the will, if the drugs work, do we have the systems in place and the will to ensure that we can get these drugs into the right hands in places like South Africa? So for example, at our Ubuntu clinic, we now start with HIV positive pregnant mothers. And we've had a 100% success rate ensuring their babies born HIV negative. So I think that's an amazing development over the last 16 years. The second is that the drugs that the treatment, that yes, you do have to adhere to this treatment for life. The fact that we can keep a young mother alive for 20, 25 years, we don't even know how long at this stage, on these drugs, if they're adhered to properly, allows you to then focus on the child, right? Because the minute the mother dies, the house becomes destabilized. That's where you see transactional sex. You see kids going to crime. It's survival mode. It's something we would all do. It's pure survival mode. So one of the keys to taking a child through school and into on the pathway out of poverty is keeping a young mother alive.
You know, the enormity of it all comes through in your book, too. I mean, it just seems like when, you know, as a young kid, I guess you're hard charging and everything, but it just seems like everywhere you turn, there's all these issues. How do you prioritize, I guess, is one of the questions. I mean, you talked about starting early and moving them, you know, cradle to career, but how did you come to grips with that? How do I prioritize?
I think you learn as you mature, right, that you can't do everything. And we want to actually make a difference in the kids' lives we do work with. I think that was just a big sort of, to us, that's the most important thing. And so often I look around the world and I look at organizations boasting they're working with 100,000 children. I'm thinking, God, raising children isn't scalable. It's deeply individualized. What worked for you didn't work for your sibling. And that's no different with our children. In fact, it's much harder where a young mother has to prioritize, do I buy food for my family tonight or do I buy textbooks for my son? It's so complicated, and it's sustained intervention. I think that's one of the big lessons is you can't do this in a 12-month grant cycle. I keep saying this. I want the philanthropy world to remember we don't raise our own children that way. And I think the one takeaway from the book that I'd like people to really think about and internalize is this idea of how do you invest in disadvantaged communities, whether it's the South Bronx or South Africa. It's do it in the same manner you'd want to invest in your own children and afford them the same dignity. And that's when you start to make a difference. Don't say to me, which is what I get almost every day when I'm fundraising here in New York, is, Jake, we love what you're doing, but how do you reach more kids for less money? Mm-hmm. That's the wrong question.
Well, one of the things that I think about when I think about nonprofits like yours, you go to a gala, they roll the 3 to 4 minute video or film, and it's this feel good, we change these lives. But one of the things I really like about you is that you admit, look, we don't change all the lives. There's some along the way that you can't change. Do nonprofits need to be more honest about that sort of thing? Because I think you're very frank about, look, you know, it costs a lot of money, it's not easy, and sometimes we win, sometimes we lose.
Right, it's taken us 17 years, and we're just starting to get good at what we do, right? And I always tell people, if all the nonprofit sector was doing half of what it said it was doing, there'd be no poverty in the world. We need to create an environment. And I think an environment where we can talk about I don't like using the word failures, but the challenges, the mistakes we're all making, so we can really learn from each other. And I think a lot of this falls in the unhealthy relationship, the dynamics between the funding community and the practitioners, where there are these 12-month grant cycles, and you're supposed to change the world. And every kid, you know, is even not just huge philanthropists, but someone sends in $100, they expect that child to be at MIT a year later. That's not how life works. And we need to get people to make long-term commitments to organizations, you know, 3 to 5 year commitments, whether it's $100 a year or $1 million, where we can then show people the progress we're making and judge us against that.
Jacob, thanks so much for coming in. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it.